Nazi International, Part 5, by Bert Gumus, October 3rd, 2023.
The post-war Nazi determination to dominate space.
That there were former Nazis in NASA in some very prominent positions like von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Kurt Debus, everyone knows, but few people realize that they actually influenced NASA in a pro-Nazi direction. The Nazis not only exhibited a great degree of influence inside of NASA during the heyday of its formation, up to the allegedly Apollo moon landing, but indeed, the Nazis exercised the greatest influence inside the organization, eventually co-opting or making common cause with two other significant, hidden, and esoteric influences in the space agency. The Bell Project's power plant designer at the EA, EG Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft in Berlin, was NASA flight director Dr. Kurt Debus. This is the man who was responsible for NASA's UFO files. He also ended up on the board of directors as a chairman of OTRAG. OTRAG stands for Orbital Transport and Rockets, Incorporated. It was the first private space company in history of the late 70s and early 80s by German engineer Lutz Kaiser. His goal was allegedly to develop low-cost rockets for the West German government that would cost half as much as a comparable American launch vehicle. In his search for a location to launch his rockets, he found what he was looking for in Central Africa. In 1976, the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko leased an area of about 100,000 square kilometers in what was then Zaire for unrestricted use. This corresponds roughly to the size of the former German Democratic Republic. In principle, Kaiser was free to dispose of this area and had quasi-extraterritorial rights. He also secured the rights to mine the mineral resources. Among other things, the media wrote about the Kaiser Empire in Africa and Mobutu's dreams of an African Cape Kennedy. But this area also became known as the African Area 51. OTRAG was first exposed by the then Soviet Premier and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev as being a kind of privately owned front for what was, in effect, a West German version of Area 51. In his charges, Mr. Gorbachev indicated that much more than cheap satellite launching capability was being researched. He also accused West Germany of being involved with technology transfers from U.S. corporations to Germany of cruise missile technology. And additionally, Mr. Gorbachev accused the West of conducting chemical and biological warfare research at the OTRAG facilities in Zaire. Thus, the outbreak of Ebola in that country is at least extremely suspicious.
Shaba North, the former rocket launch site in former Zaire, today's Democratic Republic of Congo and Nazi International Area 51?
NASA was never intended to be, at its innermost core and highest levels, a civilian agency, contrary to common public and media perception that NASA is an open, strictly civilian scientific institution, is the legal fact that the space agency quietly founded as a direct adjunct to the Department of Defense, tasked with specifically assisting the national security of the United States in the midst of a deepening Cold War, with its major geopolitical advisory, the Soviet Union. The ability of NASA to cloak or classify data is further compounded by the introduction of three parties of power within NASA that would have their own reasons and agendas for doing so. Over the course of years, researchers, Richard C. Hoagland and Mike Barra in their book Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA, identified three groups, each with their own connections deep within the world of occult and esoteric traditions that each held significant positions of managerial power and influence within NASA: Masons, magicians, and Nazis. The Nazi aspect of NASA was, of course, self-evident and well-known in popular culture. But less well-known were the other two occult and esoteric-based groups, the Masons and magicians. 1. The Magicians, represented by rocket engineer and solid fuel expert Jack Parsons, with his own direct and personal involvement with British magician Aleister Crowley, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and his Golden Dawn magician. Parsons was well known to have connections to other practicing occultists, such as L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and to have practiced himself on numerous occasions black magic and sex magic ritual. The influence of Parsons and the magicians runs directly from Parsons to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and other NASA centers clustered around it or directly tied to it.
Aleister Crowley, Jack Parsons, and L. Ron Hubbard, left to right, layman of Ordo Templi Orientis.
Excerpt from Contact Report 614.
Since I have been involved with the machinations of this criminal organization since its inception, I can only confirm what you say. The whole of the Scientology sect's endeavor, however, is not based solely on the establishment of a totalitarian world social order, but on the fact that a secret striving for effective world domination is prescribed, which is to encompass absolute control over all governments and authorities, as well as armies, secret services, and the entire economy. And in order to achieve this sect regards no means as too small, too difficult, or severe. Consequently, even the worst capital crimes have to be considered.
2. The Masons, represented by famous NASA director during the formative Mercury Gemini Apollo years, James Webb, and by various astronauts like Buzz Aldrin, who were all Masons. The Masonic influence was felt throughout NASA, not only in Webb's largely successful attempts to democratize NASA and raise public interest and harness of space science in public schools throughout the country, but also in the esoteric influence it wielded in the selection of mission names, mission patches, and logos, and throughout the astronaut corps. The Masonic influence is thus centered upon the central NASA bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., and, at that time, within the astronaut corps itself. In typical Masonic fashion, it was a dispersed influence, rather like the system of Masonic lodges.
Buzz Aldrin first, James Webb second. Masonic square and compass symbol.
Three, the Nazis, represented by German scientists such as von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Kurt Debus, and space medicine specialists such as Hubertus Stronghold, and so on. This influence was centered around von Braun and his team, first in the immediate post-war years in New Mexico, later in Alabama, and other installations with prominent Nazi presence.
Kurt Debus first, Werner von Braun second, Swastika-Symbol.
Three of the most compelling bits of evidence they adduce for the quiet exercise of this hidden occult influence are in the forms of mission names and patch logos, and the pervasive use of names derived from classical Egyptian or Greek mythology on the one hand, and the ritual alignments model on the other. For instance, if one looks at the official patch for the Apollo program below, armed with out-proceeding heads-up regarding the bizarre NASA focus on all things Egyptian, it becomes elemental to match the A for Apollo as an actual stand-in for Asar, the Egyptian designation for Osiris. This successful decoding of the hidden Egyptian meaning of the Apollo patch is redundantly confirmed because Asar Osiris is none other than the familiar Greek constellation of Orion, which is, of course, the background stellar constellation in the patch itself. In case you think such ritual symbolism is some kind of temporary historical aberration, confined only to the Apollo program and the 1960s think again, when NASA selected in 2007 a patch design for its CEV spacecraft, which will eventually replace the shuttle and ultimately take American astronauts back to the moon. Planned for the year May 2024, look what NASA curiously picked again.
Apollo and Orion, mission patches, depicting the constellation Orion in the Apollo patch and the 3 stars of Orion's belt in the Orion patch.
In looking at the patch, it struck Hoagland just how incongruent it was with the stated goals and mythology of NASA's official Apollo program to the moon. The patch depicts the Earth and Moon, with a flight path tracing from Cape Canaveral to a landing spot on the moon. The lunar disk is overlaid with a mythological deity, presumably Apollo, and there is a large A in the center of the patch. The design was built around a very curious feature, the constellation of Orion, with its 3 distinctive belt stars comprising the bar in A. The history of the official adoption of the names for NASA's step-by-step manned space program, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, that would culminate with manned landings on the moon, only serve to highlight the strangeness of the Apollo program logo. For the project names were deliberately adopted by Abe Silverstein from Greco-Roman mythology at a conference in July of 1960. Hoagland looked closer, and the names Mercury and Gemini quickly revealed their own strangeness. As far as the mythology goes, Mercury, the god's messenger, seems appropriate for the single-man capsule and its quick missions. Yet, the NASA symbol for Project Mercury is a representation of the element Mercury, rather than the Greek god Mercury, and is similar to a stylized Egyptian ankh.
NASA symbol for the Mercury project first, Egyptian ankh symbol second.
Alchemists considered mercury the first matter from which all other metals were derived. So was this a dual alchemical meaning for the name Project Mercury? Gemini, which means the twins in Latin, could not only refer to the 2-man capsule, but also to the rendezvous and docking procedures which were perfected on Project Gemini, and which were crucial to the later Apollo missions to the moon. Gemini is also frequently referenced to the constellation that borders Orion and boasts the twin stars Castor and Pollux as its most prominent features. Other myths link Castor and Pollux with the morning and evening stars, the planet Venus. Certainly, there is an inherent duality with all of these associations that well fits the twins' designation of the NASA program. 2 astronauts, 2 vehicles rendezvousing in space, the twin stars Castor and Pollux. But it was the Apollo patch that remained anomalously strange. Why call NASA's earliest manned spaceflight programs Apollo, or for that matter, Mercury and Gemini at all? Why the classical mythological and astrological focus? And why call it Apollo at all when the very constellation depicted in the patch is Orion? Hoagland consulted a semi-official book on the Moon program, which included a short citation from World Book Encyclopedia describing the mythological associations of Orion. Orion, the mighty hunter, was the son of the Greco-Roman god of the sea, Poseidon Neptune. The goddess Artemis Diana fell in love with Orion, but her brother Apollo took exception to this and tricked Artemis Diana into killing Orion. And at this point in the semi-official history of the Moon program, the obvious question occurred. Even this description, full of line after line about Orion compared to a single mention of Apollo, shows how much more important Orion is to the patch than Apollo. So why call the program Apollo at all? And why name the program after a petulant god who tricks his sister into murdering her lover? Is this the image NASA wanted of its first space pioneers, rather than the mighty hunter Orion? Why not just call the project Orion? The deliberate mixing of an Egyptian reference in the Apollo program logo, however, is significant, for Orion is, of course, another reference to Osiris, who plays such a central role in the Egyptian death and resurrection myth, and in that myth, there was a direct connection to the moon. For those who do not know the basic outlines of this legend, Osiris was murdered again through a trick at the hands of his brother Set, symbolized by the constellation Taurus. Vengeance is taken upon Set Taurus by the Osiris-Izan, Horus, represented by the star Sirius, and in some cases associated with the moon, resurrects Osiris. The story, Hoagland and Bora comment, is laden with paleophysical meanings, for it is full of astronomical references, including hints via key-coded numbers in the narratives, that the Egyptians fully understood the concepts of precession, lunar cycles, and stellar motion. There are also strong hints that these beings were not mythical gods at all, but rather real flesh and blood beings from an advanced civilization that visited Earth in antediluvian times. Both Egypt and Sumer viewed themselves as a legacy, and a declined one at that, from something far more ancient and much more sophisticated. As those texts indicate, the gods indeed taught early mankind the arts and some of their advanced sciences of civilization. Such interpretations of these texts was common currency in the esoteric circles and secret societies hovering in the background of the Nazi Party. But that left the initial question even more starkly outlined. What is a mythological Egyptian stellar deity doing representing an official U.S. governmental exploration of the moon? And in a program known under the designation of a Greek sun god, Apollo. Why not, for example, Diana, the Greek goddess of the moon? The initial answer is quite simple. Apollo is actually Horus. If one examines in detail Greek mythological literature and its derivations from the earlier Egyptians. Horus, like Apollo, is the Egyptian god of the sun, and also, curiously, ruled over Mars. Thus, it turns out that the $20 billion NASA Apollo exploration program of the moon was, in fact, nothing less than a disguised Osiris-Horus lunar landing program, straight out of ancient Egypt. At this point, it should be clear that the Nazi International are nothing but a continuation of the Giza intelligences and were cleverly hiding behind NASA. But there is also strong evidence that suggests that the Nazi International Jitter Giza intelligences were collaborating and working with the descendants of so-called Earth foreigners, which I suggested in the articles The Earth Foreigners and the Minoan Religion. And the Dogon Earth foreigner connection could be the descendants of Minoan, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican. Gods especially worth mentioning in the context of this article, Horus, Osiris, and Isis.
The Nazi Earth Foreigner Connection.
As mentioned in Nazi International Part 3, the assassination attempt of Pope John Paul II by Mehmet Ali Agca was carried out by the Nazi-sponsored secret Turkish society called the Grey Wolves on the 64th anniversary of the first Marian apparition at Fatima. This can hardly be a coincidence. And when one thinks of the Marian apparition of Fatima, one automatically thinks of the Earth foreigners.
Excerpt from Contact Report 710.
Then I want to end this subject and hear from you what you have to say about the matter of the Giza intelligences, who were in reality the Earth foreigners, of whom there has been talk since time immemorial. So I have another question about Fatima, because at that time, on the 12th or 13th of October 1917, tens of thousands of onlookers in central Portugal were able to observe and witness a furious solar phenomenon. As early as the mid-1950s, Asket told me that the whole thing had been arranged by the Earth foreigners, whereby Asket also took me back in time to the exact moment when the event took place, which gave me the opportunity to observe the spectacle for myself and to realize that the alleged solar phenomenon had been conjured up for the whole crowd of onlookers by an Earth foreigner's flying objects
So, why would the post-war Nazi International Giza Intelligences choose the 64th anniversary of the first Marian apparition for the assassination of Pope Paul II? Could it be that the today's descendants of the Earth foreigners, Osher, hiding behind the esoteric and occult Masonic Lodge of NASA to maintain and expand their influence and control over the world as gods once like their ancestors did? Because after all, whoever gains control over space automatically has control over the world. There is also numerological evidence for the collaboration between the Nazi International, Giza Intelligences, and a certain part of the Earth foreigners. Note, numerology influences NASA planning at a very deep level. The assassination attempt of Pope Paul II by the Nazi International sponsored Mehmet Ali Agca was carried out on May 13, 1981. The first Marian apparition in Portugal, at Fatima, happened also on May 13, 1917. In total, there were 6 Marian apparitions at Fatima, and all of them happened on the 13th day.
Wikipedia information.
After this preparation, the 3 shepherd children saw on May 13, 1917, a lady dressed all in white above a holm oak. Lucia conducted the dialogue with the lady. The children were asked to come to the same place for 6 months, each time on the 13th.
Note to what was said. The children were asked to return always on the 13th.
The 3 Shepherd Children of Fatima, 1917.
The second apparition of the lady happened on June 13, 1917. The third apparition on July 13, 1917. The fourth apparition on August 19, 1917. The date of the fourth apparition does not coincide with the number 13 only because the authorities kidnapped the children, pretending that they had to come to the priest to put an end to the coming riot. The children, therefore, spent August 13 in prison and missed the announced date. Then, after their release, when the children were again tending the sheep, the lady therefore appeared to them on August 19th. The fifth apparition, September 13th, 1917, the sixth and most famous apparition where the actual miracle of the sun took place, as already mentioned, on October 13th, 1917.
The crowd at Cova da Iria looking towards the sun on 13th October 1917.
The logical question now would be, why the so-called Lady of Fatima asked the children for 6 months to appear always on the 13th in the same place? The agenda of the Earth foreigners for all these Marian apparitions is obvious: to maintain and expand their power and position as gods on Earth, as their ancestors once did. And the best chances to fulfill their goals for power and domination were, they always had to perform the above-mentioned events on a 13th, as a kind of ritual adjustment to reinforce their desired intentions in relation to numerology, respectively Kabbalism. Because in old occult traditions it is said, who knows the meaning of the number 13, possesses the key to power and domination.
Excerpt from Contact Report 127.
But now, I am also well aware that many Earth twits have likewise dealt with Kabbalism for many centuries and millennia and have compiled a great deal about this calculation technique. But in old times, the true numerical values were lost in part through destruction by fire or other loss. Years ago, however, I found a book by an old count who called himself Chero and who wrote the Book of Numbers.
Excerpt from the book, Numerology, The Mystery of Numbers, book by Chero, page 98 to 103.
It is well known that most people have a peculiar seemingly ingrained awe of the number 13. However, this so dreaded number is not really an unlucky number for those who are aware of its significance. Probably the fear of this number has its cause in the fact that it was very often used in connection with occult matters, and occultism is, as is well known, a field which, according to its nature, was or is not familiar to most people. The number 13 was considered in any case, berets in old times, as an enormous, meaningful cause, an effect dominating or indicating number. In ancient occult lore it is said, "He who knows the meaning of the number 13 possesses the key to power and domination."
But a gloomy meaning of the number 13 is not excluded. Even nowadays, it often happens that there is no room with the number 13 in a hotel. By the way, in the Italian theaters, there are no seats with the number 13, but the shyness of this number is limited only to some areas of the world. Elsewhere, it is highly revered or appreciated. In the Indian pantheon, there are 13 statues of Buddha. Most Indian and Chinese pagodas are surrounded by 13 disc-shaped decorations. In the shrine of the Temple of Atsusa in Japan is kept a sacred sword, the pommel of which is formed of 13 representations of the mystery story. If we go further west on the globe, we learn that 13 was the sacred number of the Mexicans. They also knew 13 snake slayers in their lore. Finally, we should mention the positive role that the mysterious number 13 even plays in North American tradition. The United States of America were originally formed by 13 member states whose Latin motto, E pluribus unum, out of many the one, is made up of 13 letters. The two wings of the North American heraldic or state eagle consist of 13 feathers each. And when George Washington raised the Republican standard for the first time, he was greeted with 13 gun salutes.
Conclusion.
Pope Paul II survived the assassination attempt and attributed this happening immediately as a miracle and rescue of the grandmother Maria, and thanked her also with a pilgrimage to Fatima, which again maybe was pre-calculated by the descendants of the earth foreigners for the attainment of more power and rule by manipulation of religion, in this case, of Christianity. Because after all, don't you think if the Nazi International Giza Intelligence's earth foreigners wanted the Pope dead, he would surely be dead too? In 2019, approximately 6.3 million pilgrims came to Fatima, more than to any other pilgrimage site in Europe. Many of them came in one of the 4,284 groups of pilgrims who registered with the pilgrimage office. 2,854 of them came from abroad from more than 80 countries, and 1,530 from Portugal. Opposite the old Basilica of the Rosary, the new Basilica of the Most Holy Trinity was consecrated in 2007. With almost 9,000 seats, it is the fourth largest Catholic church in the world. Between the two churches is also the largest church forecourt in the world. However, it must be said that there is strong evidence that since ancient times the so-called earth foreigners are internally divided into two separate groups or elites with two different paths and two different goals, which I will explain thoroughly in a 3-part article series called Earth Foreigners Revealed. The two ancient elites that rule the world. But why associate the Egyptian god of rebirth and resurrection, Osiris, via his son Horus Apollo, to this program at all? It was only after Hoagland noted the name of another space vehicle, the shuttle Atlantis, that he began to put the pieces together. What if this wasn't the first time man had reached across space to touch the moon? What if the ancient Egyptian Zep Tepi, literally the first time, era of Osiris, Isis, Horus, was not a myth, but a reality? Hoagland began to search the record for other Egyptian connections in the names associated with the Apollo program. And he found them. The lunar module of Apollo 15 was named Falcon, and Falcon of the Horizon was, of course, one of the titles of Horus. Additionally, the Apollo 16 lunar excursion module had been openly named Orion. The Apollo command module Columbia drew its name from Saint Columba, a 6th century monk who, in Masonic lore, brought a sacred stone to Scotland from Egypt. But program logos and Egyptian connections were not all that Hoagland discovered. Perhaps the most significant indicator, if not surely one of the most controversial, was his discovery that NASA's moon landings appeared to have been deliberately coordinated with astrological significances in mind. The key mission that tipped him off, as far as the moon program was concerned, was Apollo 10. Here is it necessary to cite dark mission at length, with all of the primary technical and mission planning components having been tested and proven out. The next mission was a full-up dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. Launched May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 acted as a pathfinder for Apollo 11's Eagle, following the same descent path that Apollo 11 would 2 months later. Eventually, Thomas P. Stafford piloted Snoopy to within 8.4 miles of the lunar surface, about 44,000 feet, prompting lunar module pilot Gene Cernan to comment ominously, "Man, we's getting down among them." Given that their altitude was nearly 50,000 feet above the lunar surface, we can't help but wonder what Cernan was talking about. At that altitude, lunar surface features, even mountains, would be obscure and far away. However, given where Stafford and Cernan were at that moment, passing through Sinus Meaty and heading on toward Mare Smithy, the only thing they could have been down among at 50,000 feet would be Hoagland's theorized miles-high glass domes. Undeniably, the location and the altitude would be correct for that to be what Cernan was talking about. This bizarre comment also raises the other strangely incongruous aspect of Apollo 10. While the spacecraft was theoretically fully capable of landing on the moon, inexplicably it was not given the capability to do so. Not only was the mission denied the fuel to make a safe lunar landing, the tanks on board were literally only half filled, but the lunar module, Snoopy, was a crippled version of the real vehicle, unable to physically land on the lunar surface. Politically, this makes no sense. Still in a fierce race with the Soviet Union to be the first to land a man on the moon, Apollo 10 had everything necessary to accomplish this long-sought-after political goal. Except the tools to do so. The Saturn V, the lunar module, and the command service module had all been tested on previous missions, and the NASA Long-Distance Lunar Communications Network was tested on Apollo 8. There was no practical canonical reason not to land Apollo 10. With only 2 more shots at making the goal Kennedy's end of the decade, the question is, why wait? As he delved ever deeper into the arcane, Egyptian mysteries surrounding these supposedly secular, scientific, and engineering NASA missions, Hoagland finally found his answer. Because it wasn't time yet. In other words, the only way to explain why Apollo 10 had not been given the mission assignment to make a lunar landing was quite simply that it did not fulfill some hidden requirement of the esoteric Egyptian agendas apparently driving or influencing NASA planning at a very deep level. Testing this hypothesis, Hoagland began to enter data into computer programs designed to show astronomical alignments. The results stunned him, for at the exact moment that Buzz Aldrin celebrated his allegedly now famous communion ceremony on the moon, Sirius, stellar symbol of Isis, resurrector and consort of Osiris, was at 19.5 degrees elevation from the horizon. And 19.5 was one of the key numbers encoding a hyperdimensional tetrahedral physics. Furthermore, this implied that well before the alleged Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, there were individuals within NASA who were fully informed about aspects of its hyperdimensional physics. To give the esoteric and numerological connections even more weight, Aldrin's alleged communion ceremony took place exactly 33 minutes after the Eagle had landed. And Aldrin was one of the astronauts who was a Mason. The odds against all this being coincidental are, of course, quite high. Further investigation yielded similar Egyptian astronomical correlations for Apollo 12.
Excerpt from Contact Report 203.
As we have already explained several times, the Americans' Apollo 11 moon landing on the 20th of July, 1969, did not take place because everything was a great designed swindle through which the entire world was fooled.
Note: only because the Apollo 11 moon landing was staged It does not mean that the above-mentioned numerological values during the staging of the moon landing do not fulfill a specific purpose. These alignments implied something else, and something extraordinarily significant. Consider only the complex degree of planning and coordination that has to occur in order for such a mission to be pre-planned. Going to the moon or any other planet with current propulsion technology requires a tremendous amount of careful and prior mission planning. Because fuel and rocket thrust are very limited, leaving for a specific planetary designation with a precisely timed pre-planned arrival time and specific landing site in mind requires an immense amount of detailed knowledge of key celestial mechanics. This encompasses all relative planetary and spacecraft motions, ranging from precise planetary orbits to planned spacecraft departure and arrival times to the individual planetary rotation rates themselves. The latter critically impact mission departure and arrival times, if not the intended landing site geometry itself. Bluntly put,
these considerations meant nothing less than that the astronomical astrological alignments exhibited by these landings must have had the highest mission planning priority
over all other publicly stated goals of the Apollo landing program. They would have to be given top priority over all other objectives, be they political, general mission science, specific lunar geological sampling, and even crew safety. Even the man who trained the astronauts and who ultimately selected them had his own Egyptian connections. In fact, he, Farouk El-Baz, was Egyptian. Moreover, his father was an expert in Egyptian religion, and particularly its astronomical symbolisms.
El-Baz first, training Ronald Evans and Robert Overmyer.
There were even ritual alignments operative when President Kennedy made his famous speech before Congress, setting the goal of reaching the moon before the decade was out. For as it turned out, those alignments, coupled with Apollo 12 and Surveyor 3's landing site, fixed an entire lunar ritual network. All three groups' magicians, Masons and Nazis could claim a justifiable interest in esoteric matters as a part of their pedigree. And thus, Hoagland and Barra concluded that, at a very early period, even before the founding of NASA itself, these three groups made common cause and literally stole the entire space program for themselves from the rest of all mankind.
The biggest ritual alignment of them all.
Noting that two of the crucial landings, Surveyor 3 and Apollo 16, the first of which had indeed helped fix the entire lunar landing ritual grid, actually occurred on April 20th, 1967 and 1972. April 20th was Adolf Hitler's birthday. Again, put this in the context of the detailed and complex planning required to land a particular spacecraft on a particular day and time on another planet, and at a particular place. Such landings could not be accidental. Moreover, the Apollo 16 lunar excursion module was named Orion, which, when combined with the obvious symbolism of a landing on Hitler's birthday, strongly suggested a potential resurrection, specifically on his birthday, of something in the name of Hitler. Given the esoteric ideology of Nazism itself, an ideology that, in Heinrich Himmler's Ancestral Research Bureau, sought to trace German ancestry back to the Aryan race they believed to have colonized Sumer and Egypt, the conclusion for Hoagland and Barra was inescapable, and it is best to allow them to tell it in their own words. This new ritual coincidence, a second NASA mission deliberately landed on the day of Hitler's birth, finally brought the astonishing set of alignments into crystal clear, sharp focus. For, by these repeated ritual coincidences, commemorating the infamous leader of the Third Reich, the key players behind this entire NASA lunar ritual were now overwhelmingly identified as none other than the NASA members of the former Reich. NASA, at the highest levels, had effectively been taken over from the Masons by von Braun. Authors note, In my opinion, it was not so much a takeover, but more a collaboration between these two groups. Nazis' Giza intelligences, Masons' Earth foreigners. That has existed for thousands of years, which I will explain in upcoming articles, and that leads us in turn to another grouping at NASA, to the so-called magicians, and the possibility that certain extraterrestrials may have also been or still are behind this grouping as well.
NASA's magicians and the long-skulled gods of Egypt.
As mentioned above, the magicians at NASA were represented by rocket engineer and solid fuel expert Jack Parsons and British occultist Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley is said to have contacted a being from another dimension called Lam.
Excerpt from Contact Report, 826.
So also, for example, with regard to extraterrestrials who really came here, such as the long skull ones who came from outer space, and authors note, another dimension? To Earth, Svath said, but which I should not say and keep silent about.
This sketch by Crowley is supposedly drawn from life, and it was displayed publicly in 1919 before the so-called gray aliens became known and popular in modern culture.
This being called Lam bears also resemblance to the long-skulled gods, or extraterrestrials, that once ruled over Egypt. See Contact Report 710.
4 examples of elongated skulls found at the archaeological site in Paracas, Peru. The DNA fragments studied indicate that they are a different human-type creature, far removed from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The cranial volume is up to 25% larger and 60% heavier than conventional human skulls, and only 1 parietal plate instead of 2, meaning the head could not have been intentionally deformed by flattening. Possible depiction of the long-skulled gods of Egypt.
This quote from Aleister Crowley may provide further evidence for this thesis. The way. Lam is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path, in Buddhistic phraseology. Its numerical value is 71, the number of this book. Parsons, as also mentioned before, was well known to have connections to other practicing occultists, such as L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. And that leads us to Xenu, Scientology's galactic overlord, and the similarities in appearance to the being called Lam and the long-skulled gods of Egypt mentioned above.
The story of Xenu, created by L. Ron Hubbard, is part of the belief of Scientologists in extraterrestrial civilizations, an intervention of alien beings in the events on Earth.
Interesting to know.
It is now widely known that the assassination of President Kennedy was masterminded by a group of interests consisting of the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, a pro-Cuban group, oil barons, and the military-industrial complex. But most people don't realize that above all of these groups was Martin Bormann's Nazi International, the real mastermind of the whole operation. The Gehlen organization may not only have taken a hand in the actual training of Lee Harvey Oswald for his defection to the Soviet Union after all. Who else had the experience of operations behind the Iron Curtain to the extent that Gehlen's organization did? See Nazi International Part 4. But there is also the matter of Kennedy's threatening to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. This, coupled with his offer to go to the moon jointly with the Soviet Union, took direct aim at 2 of the bureaucracies and the suns into which Nazis had infiltrated, NASA and the CIA. Moreover, such cooperation would have directly threatened the putative Nazi International with exposure. And consider the other fingers, pointing to Martin Bormann and his Nazi International. Hoagland and Barra have strongly stated that the hidden agenda of the Apollo missions by the Nazis was the recovery of alien technology from the moon. Further, they claim that it was clear from the ritual timing of Kennedy's critical address to that joint congressional session, May 25, 1961, that the Nazis had carefully set up the president on what the real objectives of Apollo would become, including the in situ reconnaissance and return to Earth of artifacts from the ancient ruins that the Nazis somehow knew about and clearly viewed as being left by their own ancestors. If this is true, no wonder Kennedy was murdered. Immediately after his repeated offer to share this priceless Nazi heritage with their worst enemies, the Russians. And there is Alan Welsh Dulles himself, a member of the Wall Street elite that helped establish the technology transfers between the United States and Germany, and the very elite that also helped to establish the enormous monster of the German cartel system between World War I and II. Dulles, of course, became a director of the CIA, remained friends with Galen, and was fired by Kennedy for his part in the disastrously unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Yet, even with these conflicts of interest, Lyndon Johnson appointed him as a member of the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death. And present with him as a member of that commission was John J. McCloy, former Allied High Commissioner for occupied Germany and a former lawyer for I.G. Farben's interests in America. Small wonder, then, that neither District Attorney Jim Garrison nor Oliver Stone in his celebrated movie, JFK, really knew how to deal with the Nazi connection. And more importantly, it also indicates that the two-track space program, the one with rockets for public consumption, represented by Apollo, with its own hidden archaeological agenda, and the secret one with exotic physics and alternative technologies, represented by the Bell Etc., Dr. Richter C., Nazi International Part 2, and the presence of the Bell Project's power plant designer, NASA flight director, Dr. Kurt Debus, was alive and well.